Cher has spent more than 50 years telling a story about her own blood. She claimed 1/16th Cherokee from her mother's side, sewed that story into her stage costumes, sang it into a #1 hit, and printed it into every official biography spanning 5 decades, on a foundation that no family tree, no historical record, and no DNA sequence could verify. Then genetic science started asking questions, and what the investigation found was not a simple answer to that story, but an entirely different story, one that Cher had carried in every cell since birth, but apparently never truly chose to tell. She grew up not knowing what her great-grandfather's name meant in Armenian, not knowing her great-grandmother had changed her name to something more American-sounding when she set foot on this land, not knowing her father's family had fled a region on fire in order to survive. That story, the one recorded in immigration files, in cemeteries, in the memories of relatives she never met, is stronger, deeper, and more painful than anything she ever put on stage. If that makes you pause, then what comes next will make it impossible to look away. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part, where we will explore why millions of Americans, not just Cher, all tell the same Cherokee story, and why nearly all of them are wrong. Before judging Cher, answer this question. Why do millions of white Americans, not 1, not 10, but millions, claim to have Cherokee blood? And why are nearly all of them wrong? This question does not excuse Cher. It places her story in its proper context, not the story of one exceptional individual, but the symptom of something much larger and very American. Let's start with a number. More than 1 million Americans claim Cherokee ancestry in census surveys and genealogy questionnaires. The number of officially federally recognized members in the 3 recognized Cherokee tribes is around 400,000. The gap between those two numbers is not an arithmetic error. It is not an administrative mistake. It is a map of a myth that has taken root so deeply in American culture that no one even recognizes it as a myth anymore. Researchers have named this phenomenon Cherokee Princess Syndrome. Its identifying features are always the same, repeating across millions of unrelated families. Somewhere in the family tree there is a woman, olive skin, high cheekbones, thick black hair, and someone, a grandmother, an uncle, an elder in the family, said that was a sign of Cherokee ancestry. The story gets passed along. No one checks. No one needs to check, because it explains what needs explaining. This is not a story about people deliberately fabricating origins. This is a story about a culture that created the perfect conditions for this kind of story, to be born, nurtured, and passed down for generations without any evidence. The next question is more important than the numbers. Why Cherokee? America has hundreds of federally recognized native tribes. Why not Navajo? Not Sioux, not Choctaw, but almost always Cherokee. The answer lies in a slow but consequential cultural shift. For most of the 19th century and the early 20th century, Native Americans in the American cultural imagination were the enemy, the danger to be conquered in Saturday matinee cowboy movies. Then the 1960s arrived, then the 1970s, and that image flipped. Native people were no longer a threat. They became symbols of everything industrialized society had lost: closeness to nature, wisdom that money couldn't buy, a connection to the land that urban white Americans were craving in the era of Woodstock and the environmental movement. In that context, having native ancestry was no longer something to be ashamed of. It was something to be proud of. And Cherokee specifically became the default choice for a reason. They were the best-known native tribe in America, the most romanticized in American literature and film. Their history, the Trail of Tears, their highly developed civilization, the tragedy of removal, was complex enough that no one could easily dismiss a claim just by looking at a map. In the entertainment industry, the equation became brutally simple: a face that didn't fit standard white American categories, plus a claim of native difference that could be sold. Not a problem that needed explaining. In 1973, Cher had a face that no one in the industry knew how to categorize. Cherokee was the answer the market was ready to hear, ready to buy, and ready not to question. But there is one detail in Cher's story that, when you look at it long enough, begins to create unease in a way no other part of the story does. It is the timing. Journalists and researchers have systematically compared Cher's official biographies, the documents released by her record label, the background summaries that accompanied interviews, the profiles published in newspapers, before and after October of 1973. Before October of 1973, Cher's story was consistent. Father was Armenian. Mother had Irish and German roots, no Cherokee, no 1/16th, no native ancestry of any fraction. October of 1973, the song Half-Breed shot straight to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and held the position for 2 weeks. And in the weeks and months that followed, the story began to change. 1/16th Cherokee from her mother's side appeared in biographies, then in interviews, then in the stories Cher told on stage, then in the costumes she wore while singing it. The tone here needs to stay cool and precise because this is not evidence of guilt. A timing coincidence is not a confession, but it is evidence of a coincidence that needs explaining. And for more than 50 years, no explanation has been offered. The question remains unanswered and still sits there, uncomfortable, unmoving. Did the Cherokee story appear at the same time as the song because it was convenient timing to tell it? Or was the song written because the Cherokee story had actually been there all along? No one asked that question for 50 years. And the reason no one asked it wasn't because no one noticed the coincidence. The reason is that the wall was not built with lies. It was built with repetition. When millions of Americans say the same thing about themselves, no one questions it anymore. The claim becomes the default truth, not because it was proven, but because it was repeated enough times to become the foundation rather than the question. In the 1970s, claiming Native American ancestry had no legal consequences. No one checked, because no one had a practical reason to check. Recognized tribes did not accept DNA as membership evidence, and the government did not investigate the family history claims of entertainers. In that environment, the Cherokee story existed not because it was true, but because there was no mechanism to ask whether it was true. The wall was not built with lies. It was built with questions that were never asked. And the first of those questions is so simple it's hard to understand why it took so long for someone to ask it. Does Cher actually have Cherokee ancestry? What do you think you need to prove that someone does or does not have Cherokee ancestry? An interview? A confession? Some lost document found in a box of family papers? No. You need 3 things. And when all 3 point in the same direction, the story ends. The first thing is genealogy, not the kind of family tree that people piece together from family memories, but systematic record research, tracing back through each generation with real documents. Birth certificates, census records, marriage certificates, land records, church records. The genealogy site wargs.com did exactly that with Cher's family tree. They traced back 9 generations looking into the past, from the late 18th century to the early 20th century. The result? No Cherokee. Not a single name. Not a single record linking to any native community. To understand why that matters, you need to understand one thing about how the U.S. government recorded native people. If Cher's Cherokee ancestor existed at the 1/16th level, meaning one person in the great-great-grandparent generation, that person would have lived around the late 19th century. That is exactly the period when the Dawes Rolls, compiled from 1898 to 1906, recorded members of the federally recognized native tribes, including Cherokee, for the purpose of dividing federal land. This was not a record created to help native people. It was a record created to control assets. The government had a specific financial interest in knowing exactly who was a member and who was not. Those records were not erased the way slave records were erased. They still exist, and Cher's family names are not in them. The absence here is not a random gap in incomplete records. It is a signal. The second is timing, and this is evidence that requires no laboratory, no microscope, Only the ability to place two pieces of paper side by side and read what is written on them. This part was mentioned earlier, but needs to be viewed as independent evidence, completely separate from genealogy and DNA. Researchers worked systematically. They took official documents about Cher, published newspaper interviews, record label background files, television program materials, official biographies, and divided them into two groups, before October of 1973 and after October of 1973. In the first group, no document mentions Cherokee, no 1/16th, no native ancestry of any fraction. In the second group, the Cherokee claim appears and begins to be repeated. October of 1973 was the month Half-Breed climbed to number 1. The timing coincidence is not guilt, but it is a question. And the question deserves to be answered with something harder than a coincidence. That harder thing is the third tool. DNA is the most important tool of the three, and also the most misunderstood, so it is necessary to be clear about both what it can do and what it cannot do. Genetic ancestry analysis combines three different types of data. Mitochondrial DNA is passed from mother to child through every generation without mixing. It is an unbroken maternal thread running straight from the living woman back to the first woman in that line. The Y chromosome is passed from father to son in the same way, creating a paternal thread. Autosomal DNA is the rest, the total genetic inheritance from all ancestors in roughly the last 5 to 10 generations, mixed and passed on in a more complex way, but still analyzable. The important thing to understand about DNA is that it does not judge. It does not care about the story you want to tell about yourself or the family story your family has believed for 3 generations. It simply compares your nucleotide sequences with global population databases and returns statistical probabilities of similarity. And in this case, what matters is that the two relevant genetic profiles, Native American and Armenian, do not overlap in any meaningful way. Native Americans carry haplogroups primarily in branches Q1A, Q1B, and C2, groups that appeared when their ancestors migrated across the Bering Strait from 15 to 20,000 years ago, and then developed in complete isolation from the rest of the world. Armenians carry haplogroups primarily in R1b, J2, and G, characteristic of the ancient Near East and Caucasus, with a completely different genetic history. There is no gray area between these two profiles. There is no case where someone carrying Armenian DNA would produce results easily mistaken for Native American DNA. It needs to be said plainly. Cher has never publicly taken an ancestry DNA test and shared the results. But what is known about her documented ancestors, Armenian father, Western European mother, allows science to infer her genetic profile with little room left for uncertainty. DNA does not issue pedigree certificates. But for this specific question, whether or not there are haplogroups characteristic of Native Americans in her genome, it is the most accurate tool humanity has ever had. 3 tools, 3 completely independent approaches. And when all 3 begin to converge, they do not just answer the question about Cherokee. They open up another question that is larger, more important, and one none of us were prepared to hear. What happens when you go looking for one thing and instead find something else? Not nothing, not disappointment, but something you did not know you were looking for. But the moment you see it, you realize it had been there all along, waiting to be recognized. That is exactly what happened when the investigation turned to Cher's genome. So what is the result? In short, there is no Cherokee in Cher's genome. But short has never been enough to understand why. Let's start with what the genealogy found, or rather, what it did not find. 9 generations traced systematically. 9 generations looking into the past, going through census records, land records, marriage certificates, church records from Arkansas, Tennessee, Georgia, and other southern states where Cher's mother's family had lived. The result was consistent across every branch examined. No Cherokee, not a single name on the Dawes Rolls. The federal records compiled from 1898 to 1906 to register members of recognized native tribes for the purpose of land allotment. it is important to repeat here. The Dawes Rolls were not a charitable record. They were created because the U.S. government needed to know exactly who had the right to receive land. Financial incentive ensured accuracy, and Cher's family names are not in them in any form. Then comes the genetic analysis. Haplogroups Q1A and Q1B, the most characteristic branches of Native Americans, which appeared when their ancestors crossed the Bering Strait and developed in isolation from the rest of the world for tens of thousands of years, do not appear in the genetic profile of Armenians or Western Europeans. Not rare, not below the detection threshold, not present. These two genetic lines do not overlap in any way that could create confusion about origins. But if there is no Cherokee in the DNA, then where did that face come from? This is the question that millions of American families have answered wrong in the same way, and Cher's story is the most classic example. High cheekbones, olive skin, eyes with a shape not typical of standard white Anglo-Saxon features. When you grow up in a society where no one teaches you how to distinguish between Near Eastern genetic traits and Native American genetic traits, when both groups lie outside your familiar frame of reference, then mistaking one for the other is natural. Armenians, Kurds, Iranians, Mesopotamians, people from the Caucasus all have features that untrained American eyes commonly misassign to Native Americans. Observation correct, interpretation wrong. And from that combination, a family story is born, passed down through generations, and never checked because it explains what needs explaining. Cher's face was not created by Cherokee. It was created by something older, more complex, and entirely different. The first question has its answer. There is no Cherokee. But if not Cherokee, then what? The answer does not lie where she pointed. It lies on the other side of the family tree, the side no one looked at because it was not used to sell a song. John Paul Sarkeesian was born in 1926 in Oakland, California. His father was George Sarkeesian. His mother was Blanche. Real name Cyranus, both Armenians who immigrated from Turkey to America in the early 20th century. Go back one more generation. Cher's great-grandfather was Hagop Dilkyan, a weaver, and her great-grandmother was Nusaper, a seamstress. They left their land, passed through Patras in Greece, and boarded the SS Alice to New York in 1912. These are people with real names in real records, not a family story passed orally through 3 generations. Immigration entry records, naturalization records, addresses in Modesto and Fresno, California, names in Arat Armenian Cemetery in Fresno, where Nusaper, who changed her name to Lucy, was buried in 1972 at the age of 94. Genetically, this bloodline leaves specific and verifiable traces. Armenian men carry Y-DNA haplogroups primarily in R1b, about 28%, and J2, about 22%. These are the 2 most common groups, characteristic of the ancient Near East and Caucasus. It is important to understand that Armenian R1b is not the same branch as European R1b. The 2 branches share the same root name but split apart over thousands of years of evolution. R1b-U106 and R1b-P312 are the Western European branches, while Armenians belong mainly to other branches within the same family. Like 2 people sharing the same surname but with no blood relation in the last several hundred years. Armenian mitochondrial DNA belongs to groups HHV-IJK-TU, all ancient Eurasian branches, with no intersection with the Q and C haplogroups of Native Americans. Cher's overall genetic profile, inferred from what is known about her documented ancestors, is approximately 50% Armenian and 50% Western European, English, Scottish, German, Irish, Dutch from her mother's side, verified through the Crouch family records in Arkansas and Tennessee. This is Cher's genome, not dry numbers. This is the map of 2 cultures. One side Western European, clear, well-documented, rarely controversial. One side Armenian, ancient, complex, and carrying a history that most Americans were never taught to recognize. And that is precisely the problem. If you do not know what Armenia is, not the geography, but the history, the meaning, the weight of that name in the 20th century, then you have not truly understood what the DNA just found. Have you heard of the Armenian Genocide? If not, that is not your fault. It is the fault of an education that chose to forget, and that is also exactly why this story matters more than you think. Armenia is a highland region located between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, a geographic crossroads where Asia, Europe, and the Near East have met not for 1 century or 2 centuries, but for thousands of years. The Persian Empire passed through. Alexander the Great passed through. Rome passed through. Then Byzantine, then the Arabs, then the Seljuks, then the Mongols, then the Ottomans. All of them passed through. Armenia remained there after all of that. Not because of luck, but because Armenians had learned how to survive in conditions that most peoples could not survive. In 301 AD, Armenia became the first nation in the world to officially adopt Christianity as the state religion, before even the Roman Empire. The Armenian alphabet was created in 405 AD to preserve the language and literature of a people facing the risk of assimilation. That language has continued to exist uninterrupted to this day, without interruption, without replacement, throughout 16 centuries since that alphabet was written. Then came 1915, and this is something that cannot be skipped if you truly want to understand what Cher's genome means. Under the Ottoman Empire during World War I, Armenians were systematically targeted. What happened from 1915 to 1923? The massacres, the deportations, the death marches across the Syrian desert killed approximately 1 to 1.5 million Armenians. A large part of an entire people's population was wiped out in less than a decade. Many governments around the world, including the United States, took many decades to officially recognize that event with the word it deserved to be called genocide. Cher's grandparents and great-grandparents were refugees from that wave of violence, or from the smaller waves of violence that paved the way for it. Hagop Dilkian boarded the ship in Patras in 1912, 3 years before the genocide erupted at its largest scale in history. Those who left early were often those who had seen enough to know they needed to go, or who had survived earlier local waves of violence enough to understand what was coming. They arrived in America. They settled in Fresno and Modesto, California, in Armenian communities that had formed from previous waves of refugees. And here is a small detail, a very small detail, but one that carries more weight than any genetic number presented in this entire story. Nusaper changed her name to Lucy. Pause there for a moment, not to create dramatic effect, but because that sentence needs space to be heard in its full meaning. Nusaper, the Armenian name she was born with, the name her parents gave her, the name tied to the language and culture of a people that had just survived catastrophe, became Lucy. Not because she wanted to, not because she decided she wanted a new name, but because an Armenian name did not open doors in America in 1912. Because that name made you look like a foreigner in the country, where you needed to become a local in order to survive. She had survived what had killed millions of her fellow countrymen. She had crossed the Mediterranean. She had boarded the ship in Patras and disembarked in New York. And then, in order to survive in that new country, she was asked to become someone else once again. This is the genome that Cher inherited. Not from a mythical Cherokee ancestor who left no trace in any record, but from Hagop and Nusaper, from the weaver and the seamstress who boarded the SS. Alice with nothing but what they could carry in their hands. Cher's face, high cheekbones, eyes that could not be categorized, olive skin in the way that made people search for explanations they were familiar with, is the biological legacy of 3,000 years of Armenian history, of a genome carrying traces of every empire that ever passed through that highland, of the weaver Hagop and the seamstress Nusaper, and those who came before them, whose names are no longer known. It was not Cherokee that created that face, it was Armenia that created it. The Cherokee story is the story of a woman who did not know where she belonged. The Armenian story is the story of a family that knew exactly who they were, and that the world tried to erase. Both stories were there in the same person. Only one story was chosen to be told. This is the question no one asked for the past 50 years. Did Cher know her Armenian story? And if she knew it, why was that story never told? To answer that question, we need to start with what science confirms. Not about the absence of Cherokee, but about the depth of what was really there. A whole genome study of Armenians published in 2024 confirmed what geneticists had suspected for decades. The Armenian population carries genetic traces from at least different ancient population sources: Neolithic Levantine farmers, Pontic steppe pastoralists, and Neolithic Anatolian populations, accumulated over thousands of years of settlement, in a land where not one or two, but nearly all of humanity's major migrations passed through. That created a rare genetic profile. Armenians account for nearly half of all mitochondrial DNA haplogroups recorded globally. Not because they are ancestors of the rest of the world, but because the Armenian highlands, due to their geographic position at the crossroads of three continents, had been a transit point for human migrations for tens of thousands of years, and retained a genetic diversity that most other populations had lost over time and through isolation. What does that mean for Cher specifically? Her genome is not half Armenian and half Western European, in the simple sense of adding two equal parts. It is a living map of nearly every major civilization that ever existed in Western Asia, accumulated over thousands of years before her great-grandfather Hagop Dilkian boarded the ship in Patras. This is her real heritage, and no one taught her to see it that way. The question is not why she did not know, but why, even when known, that story was still not chosen. John Sarkeesian left Cher when she was less than 10 months old. He reappeared when she was 11, a short, intermittent period, and by every description she has given of him across decades, not enough to create anything that could be called transmission. The absence of the father did not just erase the presence of one man. It erased context. It erased the stories that needed to be told directly from the person who had lived them to the next person. Hagop Dilkian and the SS Alice voyage. Newsaper and the name she changed to survive. Ararat Cemetery in Fresno and the graves with Armenian names on the headstones. All of that needed a storyteller. The storyteller was not there. And without those stories, the Armenian heritage became what it looked like from the outside. Hard-to-read names in immigration records, a community in Fresno that no one in the Hollywood entertainment industry knew how to frame. But there is one detail in Cher's story that few people know and few people mention, and it makes the question more complicated in a way that cannot be resolved by simple reasoning. In 1993, Cher led a humanitarian shipment to Armenia. The country had just emerged from the Soviet Union, facing famine, war with Azerbaijan, and collapsing infrastructure. She went there with food, medicine, and aid. She stood on Armenian soil. She saw the land that her grandparents and great-grandparents had left or been driven from. She knew her origins on her father's side. That was not a secret, not something she had never mentioned. But that story was never placed at the center of her story. It remained on the periphery, a nice detail, a charitable act, not the core of the identity she brought to the stage. Why? This is a question with no clear answer, and any answer needs to be presented as observation rather than judgment. The Cherokee story did not require American audiences to know anything they had not been taught. It did not require them to know where the Armenian highlands are on a map, or why 1915 was an important year, or what the difference between Armenians and Turks was, and why that difference mattered to the point of life and death. It did not require them to do any cognitive work. The Armenian story required all of that. In the 1970s, the word Cherokee immediately evoked a whole set of images in the American mind. Images that might not be accurate, might be romanticized, but were present and ready. The word Armenia evoked nothing for most American audiences at that same time. Not because the story did not exist, but because it had never been told enough to create a frame of reference. This is a real cultural asymmetry, and it explains more than any theory of bad intent or conscious calculation. Nusaper changed her name to Lucy. Cherylin Sarkeesian changed her name to Cher. Both were acts of assimilation, one carried out by a refugee who had just survived catastrophe and needed to survive in a new country, one carried out by a young artist who needed to survive in an entertainment industry with its own rules about names and stories. Not guilt, not conspiracy. But both were losses, and loss does not need bad intent to be loss. The question is not who is to blame. The question is what disappears when stories like the Armenian story, the story of refugees, of survivors, of people who changed their names to be accepted, are replaced by stories that are easier to tell and easier to hear. Science has done its part. It has confirmed what was there and mapped what was not there. What remains is not a question about Cherokee, nor about Armenia. What remains is a question about all of us. Now you know what the DNA found, but here is what no test, no database, and no laboratory in the world can answer. When a woman has a true story available and chooses to tell a different one, what is she giving up? In 2017, after a new wave of criticism surfaced on social media about the song and the feathered costumes associated with it, Cher wrote on Twitter that the song was made 50 years earlier and was not intended to offend, then paused and added right away, "That was a defense, and it was not okay." She said she needed to stop singing the song and retire the costume. That was a partial admission. It touched on how the song was performed, the costumes, the imagery, the visual language, but it did not touch the more fundamental question about bloodline. No one asked that question directly, and she did not pose it herself. In 2024, the memoir Cher, the memoir, Part 1 was published and stood at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for 3 weeks. The book talks a lot about the absence of her father, about what Sonny Bono did and did not do, about the early years of her career. It did not place the Armenian story at the center. That absence was not an editorial error. It was an answer, not an answer anyone deliberately gave, but an answer that emerged from what was chosen to be said and what was not chosen. Whoopi Goldberg received her DNA results and described the feeling as recognizing something she had half known, a door opening in a wall she had stopped hoping would move. Cher has never had that moment in a public sense, not because the story was not there, but because she never put herself in a position where she needed to recognize it. That is not condemnation. It is an observation about a gap, the gap between what was there and what was recognized. This is what DNA can do. It confirms origins. This is what it cannot do. It does not define belonging. Cher did not grow up in the Armenian community in Fresno. She did not speak Armenian. She did not know the stories that her grandfather George Sarkeesian might have told if he had been there. About the Dilkian family, about the SS, Alice voyage, about the early years in Modesto when no one in the house spoke English. The genetic connection is real and undeniable, but a genetic connection is not a shared culture, not an inherited language, not a community memory passed from person to person through meals and evenings and stories told and retold until they become part of the listener. Those things were taken away, not by slavery as in the story of millions of African Americans, not by a system deliberately designed to erase lineage, but by the simple and undramatic distance between a father who left when his daughter was less than 10 months old and the daughter who grew up without him. That is a smaller loss on the scale of history, no less real in one person's life. And that, the secondary loss, unnamed, unrecorded as loss, does not excuse the Cherokee claim. It only explains why the void existed, and why the ready-made stories in the surrounding culture so often stepped in to fill the voids that families left behind. Whoopi Goldberg built her identity on the absence of origins. There was no family story to believe or doubt, only blank space and a Caribbean hypothesis that she herself admitted could not be verified. DNA gave her back the history that the system had taken away, and she recognized it as something she had half known. The story had the structure of completeness: lost, found, recognized. Cher's story does not have that structure. She had a real, specifically documented origin available in verifiable records, and that story was not chosen. DNA confirmed what had been there from the beginning, not what had been claimed for 50 years. The story is incomplete, and that incompleteness is not a storytelling failure. It is the truth, and truth is never as tidy as stories want it to be. The unavoidable question is, when we choose one story about ourselves, what story are we giving up? Newsaper became Lucy. Cherokee Sarkeesian became Cher. Two actions, two generations, two contexts that cannot be compared in urgency or consequence, but in the same direction, becoming more acceptable by giving up a part of who you are. Newsaper changed her name so she would not be recognized as a refugee in a new country. Cher changed her name so the entertainment industry would open its doors. Both survived. Both lost something. And what 50 years of the Cherokee story did, whether consciously or not, whether intentionally or not, was to continue that chain of loss in a way no one could see clearly while inside it, keeping the Armenian story invisible for one more generation, obscuring it with another story that was easier to tell, easier to hear, and did not require anyone to know anything they had not been taught. Newsaper Dilkyan passed away at Ararat Armenian Cemetery in Fresno in 1972 at the age of 94. She was Cher's great-grandmother. Her name in the records is real. Her journey, from the land she left, through Patras, through New York, to Modesto and Fresno, through 60 years of living in a country that did not speak her language, is real. Nothing more is needed to make it a story worth telling. Science confirms she was there. It cannot confirm the conversations that never happened between the great-granddaughter who did not know her and the great-grandmother who had no way to tell her story across that distance. It cannot confirm the Armenian language that was not taught, the names that were not explained, the reasons behind Newsaper becoming Lucy that no one thought needed explaining because everyone understood at the time. Those things lie beyond the reach of any laboratory. The name on the screen is always chosen. The blood is never asked for its opinion. And the distance between those two things, between the story chosen and the story inherited, is not a question about Cher. It is a question about all of us. What stories we tell about ourselves, and what stories, because they are too difficult, too painful, or because too few people know how to listen, we leave in silence. Science moves the boundary lines. It does not answer that question. Cher's story is not just the story of one celebrity. It is a mirror reflecting something very American and very human. We often choose the easier story over the true one. When the Cherokee claim appeared at exactly the right time for Half-Breed to climb to #1 on Billboard in 1973, it did not just serve a song. It served a society's need for a story that fit the template they had already prepared. Americans in the 1970s knew what Cherokee was. They did not know what Armenia was, did not know what 1915 meant for the Sarkeesian family, did not know why a seamstress named Newsaper had to become Lucy in order to live in a new country. And because they did not know, they did not ask. The real lesson here is not about Cher, but about every American family holding stories they consider not interesting enough or too hard to explain, and choosing silence or replacement with something easier to hear. Millions of American families have ancestors who were refugees, immigrants, survivors of war and disaster. Those stories do not need to be prettified or simplified to have value. They have value precisely because they are complex, because they require the listener to truly listen. Newsaper Dilkyan changing her name to Lucy was not because her story was less important, but because no one created space to hear it. The responsibility of this generation is to create that space. At family dinners, in stories told to children, in the willingness to sit with difficult questions, before the people who can answer them are no longer here. If this story makes you think about the things your own family has never told, hit subscribe, because the next videos will continue to ask the questions no one thought to ask. We will see each other in the next story.